Welcome to Middle Eastern Civilization 600 to 2014. We're going to begin the work of this class with an overview of the history of the Middle East in order to frame our larger discussion for later courses that come along. Because this course is designed for those with a beginner or basic knowledge of the Middle East, equivalent to a 100 or 200 level course you would take at a university. This course is divided into 25 chapters, which covers all the main themes of Middle Eastern history, such as the Roman conquest, Muhammad's prophetic career, the rise of Islam and the Islamic Caliphate, the Crusades, the Mongol invasion, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, World War I, the creation of the State of Israel, up to the Arab Spring and beyond. The goal of this is to show that a lot of the controversial events that are occurring in the Middle East today, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the fight between terrorism and autocrats in many Middle Eastern states, isn't a modern phenomena that's just rooted in 21st century or late 20th century diplomacy. In actuality, these events have a long history that go back decades and centuries, and some historians argue even millennia, rooted in imperial conflict back to Roman times. So the purpose of this course is to give you a specific overview of these important events in history that have happened, so you can understand why events in the Middle East are taking place the way that they are now. The key idea here is that the Middle East has been important throughout world history due to its location at the center of Eurasia. This is the reason that so many empires in ancient history competed for its real estate. It's at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Therefore, it played an important role throughout history. Right there. You'll understand better after this first lesson how ownership of key land has been at the center of Middle Eastern conflict from the beginning of civilization to the present day. So here's a quick overview. Since the beginning of civilization, many empires have competed for Middle Eastern real estate. As long as you define Middle East as a geographical region, the beginning of Middle Eastern history is synonymous with the beginning of civilization. When you were in social studies class back in high school, you likely learned a dizzying array of civilizations such as Hittites, Sumerians, Akkadians, Phoenicians, and Babylonians, which historically this is a very wide period going back to essentially the end of the Neolithic Age and the beginning of the Bronze Age, about 3000 BC, all the way up to 0 AD and the early ADs. We're not going to go into the specific attributes of these different civilizations, nor are we going to try to suggest here that there's some grand unifying link between all of them just because they happen to inhabit the same area. But that might be the main connecting point and the only connecting point that unites all of them. They were in the same land. This is why we want to focus on the connective tissue between them and the one factor that did link all of them together. They all destroyed a previous inhabitant of the Middle East and were subsequently destroyed themselves. Here's an overview of these civilizations on the map you can see here. Up in the upper right-hand corner with the Hittites, the Mutanis, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians, occupying that fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is still a pivotally important location today. There's a lot of water wars between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq because Turkey has built many dams in southeastern Anatolia. There you can see in the map at the top of the Tigris and Euphrates, and siphoned off a lot of its water for farm cultivation. As a result, there's been tension and conflict between them, so the real estate on these waterways continues to be important now, as it was 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And as we said, the thing that these civilizations had in common was the inherent conflict they had fighting over this land. Okay, but why was there so much conflict and warfare over this particular piece of real estate on the global map compared to another region? The main reason is that they inhabited some of the best real estate on the planet. While much of the region from North Africa to modern-day Iran is dry and arid, A swath of fruitful land from the Nile River to the Caspian Sea cuts through the region. It's known as, what you've probably learned, as the Fertile Crescent, and it's the convergence point for the entire Eurasian continent, for both land and sea. For example, a silk merchant traveling by ship from China to Rome, which was technically possible even 2,200 years ago, and we do see archaeological and cultural influence from the Far East on Roman art and architecture, so this isn't just a theory but highly plausible. Anyone who made this journey would have to make many stops in the Middle East in order to stock up on supplies, pay tariffs to local rulers, and secure safe passage over land from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean across Egypt. So if any sorts of military adventures were going to take place, it had to involve the Middle East. And if anyone could control this area, then they stood to reap all the profits of these activities, whether through taxing spice merchants or leasing out battle-hardened soldiers to foreign armies. So we see if you control this land, you control trade, which first connected the Middle East to the rest of the globe in 3000 BC, when routes opened up between the Indus Valley and Pakistan and Mesopotamia. For the next 5 millennia, the Middle East was the center of global activity until the discovery of the New World altered the flow of commerce and military activity. It's the value of this real estate that has made the Middle East a dynamic and also a highly volatile place throughout history and up to this day. So what we see here is that with this global trade, any time from ancient history all the way up to the beginning of the Renaissance had to go through this area. This is one of the main reasons the European Age of Discovery was launched, because Spain and Portugal and others wanted to access the Spice Islands, but they wanted a direct route because if they could get it directly, the spices would literally be worth their weight in gold. Because spices coming from Indonesia to Europe, passing through dozens if not hundreds of middlemen from the Eurasian continent traders, would see the price of spice vastly inflated. Because of this vast inflation and this trading of hands, this wealth filtered through Middle Eastern society and something that made it as rich as it was for centuries. So trade equals money, and money equals power. So before we jump into the next chapter, I want to give just a brief historical overview of some of the major players we're going to be talking about in this course. And I want to show you some maps to give you an idea of where they're put into the world scene here and why they interact with their neighbors in the way that they do. Let's look at some dates first. If we talk about the Middle East before Muhammad, and the rise of Muhammad was probably the most transformative event that happened in Middle Eastern history, you can look at it in a few distinct periods. The first is the Roman period, following the Roman conquest of the Middle East up to 330 AD. Following that is the Byzantine Empire, which is the eastern successor state of the Roman Empire. Although their power diminishes over the centuries, they actually continue onward until 1453, when they are destroyed by the Ottoman Turks. And finally, the Sasanian Empire, which lasted from 550 BC to 650 AD. The Sasanians are better known as the Persian Empire, and they occupy this period from the BCs when they're fighting with Greece, and you see them in classical literature as the Nemesis and Herodotus and other writers, up to 650 when they're absorbed by the growing Islamic Caliphate. If we jump into the Islamic period, I just want to point out some dates here. Muhammad lived from 570 to 632. He received the words of God, Wahi, or Vahi in Turkish, in 610. Following him were the 4 rightly guided caliphs, the successors of Muhammad, and this period lasted from 632 to 661. There's division between the Muslim Caliphate after the 4 rightly guided caliphs, and this is where you see the split between Sunni and Shia Islam in 661. After this, the Umayyad Empire falls, and it's replaced by the Abbasid Empire, lasting from 750 to 1258. They're really seen as the last empire that inherits the full spiritual authority that Muhammad invested in the caliphs. There's a lot of Muslim states that claim to have this authority after the Abbasid period ends, but for the most part it dies with the caliph. And then some other dates. When we look at the Middle and Late Islamic periods, I mentioned the Ottoman Empire, which lasted from 1299 to 1922. The Safavid Empire, which is in Iran, from 1501 to 1722. The Mughal Empire, which is in northern India, from 1526 to 1857. And the Qajar Empire, which is also east of the Middle East, from 1794 to 1925. The Middle East is affected heavily in the modern period by colonialism and new imperial rivalries with Russia, Great Britain, and France. Here's a map to show you the extents of the Roman Empire, and there you can see off to the right side where it dips into the Middle East. Pretty much conforming here with its maximum extent that is described by Edward Gibbon in the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, from up to Germania, down to the sands of the Sahara to the south, through Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain, off to the east at the borderlands at the Tigris and Euphrates River, down into the Arabian Desert, as you can see the terminus line from where the green border ends and the gray begins. The Sasanian Empire, which I said is the Persian Empire, you can see at this map in yellow, covered a huge area, including modern-day Iran, a lot of northern Iraq, and over into Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and other places at its eastern borders. The Byzantine Empire, which was the successor state of the Eastern Roman Empire, you can see here its borders, which is before 1000 AD. Actually here, I would say, is, as you can see, Syria is not included in here, so this would be after the rise of Islam, when Muslim armies captured a lot of the southern part of the Byzantine Empire. The Umayyad Empire, these are the maximum extents. As you can see, it's huge. This is the period after the forthrightly guided caliphs, when the Islamic world was fairly well militarily united, and it quickly conquered Byzantine holdings in the Near East, the Persian Empire, much of North Africa, all the way up to Spain. The Abbasid Empire was its successor state. It held on to a lot of the holdings that the Umayyad Caliphate captured, but then there's a lot of political fracturing that starts to happen. As different denominational groups break apart in Islam, and as local rulers rise to power, this unified red area breaks apart very quickly. So by 1258, the Abbasid Caliphate is a tiny little rump state that's mostly just centered around Baghdad, which you can see as a large yellow dot in the right side of the screen. Here's the Ottoman Empire, which lasted from 1300 to 1923. Again, it controlled a major area, and its maximum extents were from the 15 to 1600s. It falls apart in the 18th and 19th century, and what is considered as the daughter state of the Ottoman Empire is the Turkish Republic, which, if you can see Constantinople in the middle of that, is today Istanbul. And here's a map of the Safavid Empire again, modern-day Iran, occupying quite a large area, much larger than what modern-day Iran occupies. Here's the Mughal Empire in northern India. Again, all these maps show that when we think about Muslim nations, it's not just a Middle Eastern phenomena. As today, the largest Muslim nation in the world is Indonesia. The second largest is India in terms of population. So Islam is a global phenomena. To say Middle Eastern is not the same thing as to say Muslim. To say Arab is not the same thing as Muslim, because there are Arab Christians and even Arab Jews, which we'll get in later parts of the course. So I'm showing you these maps to give you an idea that the Muslim world and the Middle East aren't one and the same. There's significant overlap, but we need to understand this difference. And speaking of Islam, here's a map to give you an idea of its distribution today. Sources argue about how many Muslims there are globally, but it's somewhere between 1.1 and 1.8 billion. And like I said, the majority are in South and Southeastern Asia. There's about 1.9 to 2.3 billion Christians today, and most Muslims in the world are Sunni, although there's a number of Shias as well. Most are concentrated in Iran, as you can see, also in southern Iraq and Yemen and other parts of Afghanistan. And there's many varieties and divisions within Sunniism and Shiism. We'll talk about Sufism later. So Islam has many different denominational breakouts as Christianity does. And if you know about Christianity, there's approximately 20,000 denominations within it. There aren't quite that many in Islam, but there's still a significant variety. And here's a global map to give you an idea of where religions are concentrated. So that green swath you see from Western Africa, cutting up through the Middle East, down into Southeastern Asia, and all the way up to the Guinean island is Islam. So there's not a perfect correlation between the Middle East and Islam, but significant overlap. And some of the main language families of the Near East and Middle East are Hamto-Semitic, which is Arabic primarily, Indo-European, which primarily composes of Persian, and Ural-Altaic, which includes the Turkic languages like Turkish, Kazakh, Uyghur, Uzbek, Turkmen, and the like. So the imperial order before the rise of Islam, okay, what was there in the Middle East? Primarily the Byzantine Empire, which went through 3 stages of power. The first stage was 330 to 630, which when I showed you that map earlier of its maximum extents, corresponds to this period, mostly with the rise of Justinian the Great in the 500s, who built the Hagia Sophia, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. The second stage is 630 to 1071. After the Islamic Caliphate captures Palestine and the Near East, and the Byzantine Empire also loses some holdings in Europe, it begins to decline. From 1071, the Byzantine Empire loses much of Anatolia to the Seljuk invasion, and 1453 it's finally conquered. The character of Byzantine rule was an Eastern Hellene versus Western Roman tradition. Most of the people were Greek-speaking and Eastern Orthodox by faith, although this was definitely not always the case. The Orthodox Christian tradition and the ecumenical councils was a period in which bishops gathered together to hammer out the major doctrine of Christianity. And the Byzantine Empire remained crucially vibrant while Europe was under siege by German, Hun, and Slavic warriors. When we talk about the Dark Ages, particularly the 500s to the 900s in Europe, the East and the Byzantine Empire still maintained good educational institutions, government infrastructure, and military power at this time. There's the Hagia Sophia, which this is a current picture in Istanbul when it's now a mosque. But for 1,000 years, it was the largest church in the world, built by Justinian in the 500s. So as you can see, to be able to build an architectural feat of that magnitude required a really powerful government. And this government existed before the rise of Islam in the Middle East. Okay, so that wraps up our overview of Middle Eastern civilization and the factors that make it such a valuable real estate. In the next chapter, we're going to look at more of the specific attributes of the pre-Islamic period and understand why Islam grew so rapidly the way it did. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you there.